concrete stairs dug into his spine. Below the blinding overhead lights, 3,000 people screamed for violence, unaware that the real fight was creeping up the bleachers behind them. One cheap shot in a crowded arena didn't just test a man's chin. It tested what he was willing to break. Part 1. The friction of the crowd. Neon light buzzed from a fractured fixture high above section 114, casting a sickly, flickering yellow hue over the cheap fiberglass seats. Down on the gymnasium floor, 2 men in starched white uniforms were bowing to each other. They moved with a rigid metronomic stiffness that made Bruce's jaw clench. Every motion was telegraphed, every strike pulled short of its actual intent, safely packaged for the polite applause of the suburban crowd. It was a museum exhibit, not combat. Bruce shifted in his seat, his tailored charcoal slacks pulling uncomfortably tight against his thighs. The air up here in the cheap seats was stagnant, thick with the smell of stale popcorn, floor wax, and the damp wool of cheap winter coats. He hated sitting still. His right knee bounced in a restless rhythm, the heel of his leather loafer squeaking faintly against the sticky concrete step. He had come to the Long Beach Invitational to observe, maybe to network, but mostly, he felt like a wolf trapped in a dog show. Beside him, Dalton Clark was talking. Dalton always talked. He was a regional promoter who smelled permanently of peppermint breath mints and expensive, overpowering cologne. "You're alienating the old guard, Bruce," Dalton murmured, leaning in too close. His heavy wool blazer brushed against Bruce's shoulder. "That demonstration you gave yesterday, telling a room full of 8th-degree black belts that their classical forms are a disorganized mess? You're bad for business. You can't just walk into a town and tear down the foundation." Bruce kept his eyes on the mat below. A referee barked a command, and one of the fighters threw a sluggish reverse punch. "Das Hut ist 80. "If the foundation is made of dry rot, Dalton, you don't build on it," Bruce replied, his voice barely a rasp above the roar of the crowd. "You burn it down. What they are doing down there is swimming on dry land." He didn't want to have this conversation again. He was exhausted. Not physically. His body was a tightly coiled spring, honed by thousands of hours of obsessive conditioning, but mentally. The constant friction of trying to force a stagnant community to evolve was wearing him thin. He felt the familiar, bitter cocktail of arrogance and deep-seated isolation pooling in his chest. He knew he was right. He knew his methods were faster, sharper, and utterly grounded in reality. But proving it meant wading through a swamp of fragile egos that were currently making their way up the left side aisle. Bruce didn't look directly at them. He didn't need to. He felt the subtle shift in the crowd's energy first, a ripple of discomfort as broad shoulders bumped past seated spectators, a spilled soda, a muttered curse. His peripheral vision caught a heavy lumbering shape ascending the concrete stairs, flanked by 2 smaller, equally tense figures. Victor Lawson. Victor was a traditionalist. He ran 3 highly profitable dojos in the valley, selling ancient secrets to middle-class accountants. He was also the man whose top student Bruce had dismantled in exactly 11 seconds during a sparring session the previous afternoon. Victor was thick-chested, built like a fire hydrant, with a red, pock-marked face that currently looked flushed with something far more toxic than mere embarrassment. "Dalton," Bruce said quietly, finally stopping the restless bounce of his knee, "I think your business associates are here to collect a debt." Dalton blinked, following Bruce's gaze. The promoter's face went slack. "Christ, Victor, he's supposed to be in the VIP lounge." "He doesn't look like he's looking for the lounge." Bruce exhaled slowly through his nose. He felt a spike of genuine irritation. He wasn't afraid. Fear was a useless metric when you understood body mechanics. But he was profoundly annoyed. He was wearing a brand new suit. He was squeezed into a narrow row of bolted-down fiberglass chairs. The incline of the bleachers was a 30-degree trap of sharp edges and spilled Coca-Cola. This was the worst possible geometry for a fight. "Victor!" Dalton stood up awkwardly, raising his hands in a placating gesture as the heavy-set master stopped at the edge of their row. Victor, listen, we're in the middle of the semi-finals. Shut up, Clark, Victor snapped. His voice was a wet, gravelly rasp. He didn't even look at the promoter. His eyes, rimmed with furious red capillaries, were locked onto Bruce. Victor breathed heavily, his chest heaving under a tight black polo shirt. He smelled of sour perspiration and stale tobacco. You think you're a teacher, Lee? You think making a fool of my boy in front of the board makes you a master? Bruce didn't stand up. Standing up would concede the space, and right now, sitting down forced Victor to look down, throwing his center of gravity slightly forward. I didn't make a fool of him, Victor, Bruce said. His tone was perfectly level, devoid of the theatrical anger Victor was projecting. Physics did. He threw a wide hook. I stepped inside. If you taught him to cover his center line, he would have lasted 12 seconds. It was the truth, but it was also the exact wrong thing to say. Bruce knew it the moment the words left his mouth. A part of him, that deeply cynical, abrasive part, wanted the confrontation. He wanted to strip away the polite veneer of the tournament and show everyone what real consequence looked like. Victor's hands twitched. His two students, wearing matching tracksuits, shifted nervously behind him, blocking the narrow concrete aisle. The crowd around them in section 114 was starting to notice. Heads were turning. A woman 2 rows down pulled her purse into her lap, her eyes wide. You disrespect the lineage, Victor hissed, taking half a step into the narrow gap between the rows of seats. His heavy boot crushed an empty paper cup. You disrespect the art. You're nothing but a street fighter in a nice jacket. A jacket I would prefer to keep clean, Bruce said, finally uncrossing his legs. He planted both feet flat on the sticky concrete. He felt the subtle vibrating hum of the stadium's bass system radiating through the soles of his shoes. Go back to the lounge, Victor. Tomorrow we can put on gloves, step on a mat, and I will gladly show you where your forms are broken. But right now, you are standing in my light. Victor's face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He wasn't thinking about lineage anymore. He wasn't thinking about martial arts. He was a humiliated man, acting on pure reptilian instinct. He didn't challenge Bruce. He didn't bow. He just lunged. Part 2. The geometry of chaos. The attack was sloppy, driven by momentum rather than technique. Victor threw his entire 240-pound frame forward, aiming a clubbing overhand right aimed directly at Bruce's seated jaw. Bruce didn't attempt a cinematic block. There was no room. The fiberglass seatback of the row ahead was mere inches from his knees. Instead, he dropped his weight instantly, slipping his head to the outside of the incoming fist. Victor's knuckles smashed into the hard plastic of Bruce's empty seat with a sickening hollow crack. Splinters of cheap fiberglass flew into the air. Before Victor could recoil from the pain of the impact, Bruce moved. He didn't stand up. He launched himself upward from a compressed squat, driving the crown of his skull tight against Victor's chest while his hands shot up into the chaotic space between them. This wasn't a movie. It was ugly. It was claustrophobic. Bruce's right hand bypassed Victor's flailing arms, his fingers curling into a vicious hook that dug deep into the soft tissue of Victor's inner bicep. He pinched the nerve violently. Victor let out a choked, wet gasp, his arm going instantly dead. At the exact same moment, Bruce drove his left elbow upward, not aiming for the head, which was currently tucked out of range, but crashing brutally into the underside of Victor's jaw. Clack! Teeth collided. Victor stumbled backward, his heavy boots tangling in the narrow legroom of the bleachers. He fell hard against the row behind them, crushing a spectator's discarded jacket. Screams erupted around them. The polite applause of the karate tournament below was instantly drowned out by the chaotic roar of a very real, very unchoreographed brawl in the stands. People were scrambling, tripping over each other to get out of the splash zone. Dalton Clark was pressed flat against a concrete pillar, his face pale, frantically shouting something Bruce couldn't hear over the rushing blood in his own ears. "Get him!" Victor spit, tasting copper. He pointed a trembling, thick finger at Bruce. The 2 tracksuited students hesitated, then rushed in from the aisle. Bruce finally stepped out of his row, stepping onto the sticky concrete stairs. His heart was hammering a steady, cold rhythm. The initial annoyance had evaporated, replaced by a hyper-focused, predatory calm. The environment was terrible, but he understood spatial awareness better than anyone breathing. The first student threw a desperate lunging kick. It was a terrible choice for a staircase. Bruce didn't even block it. He simply stepped off the center line, letting the kid's momentum carry his foot past him. As the leg hung suspended in the air, Bruce checked it hard with his own shin, deadening the thigh muscle, and simultaneously shoved the off-balance student by the shoulder. The kid went down hard, tumbling awkwardly down 3 concrete steps and crashing into the metal handrail with a dull, echoing clang. One down. The second student was smarter. He rushed in close, trying to grapple, aiming to wrap his arms around Bruce's waist and drag him down to the unforgiving concrete. Bruce hated grapplers in street clothes. He felt the kid's sweaty hands grip the expensive wool of his suit jacket. Rather than pulling away, which would only tighten the grip, Bruce stepped into the embrace. He dropped his center of gravity, bringing his hips lower than his attackers, and brought both his forearms down like a pair of iron bars onto the soft crooks of the student's elbows. The grip broke instantly. Before the kid could reset, Bruce snapped a short, brutal backfist into the bridge of his nose. The cartilage gave way with a soft crunch. The kid shrieked, dropping to his knees, his hands clutching his face, as dark blood immediately began pouring through his fingers, spotting the gray concrete. Bruce barely had time to register the blood before a massive weight slammed into him from the side. Victor was back up. He had used the distraction of his students to circle slightly higher up the stairs, and now he threw his entire bulk downhill. The impact drove the breath from Bruce's lungs. He felt a sharp, agonizing pain in his ribs as he was driven sideways, slamming violently into the waist-high concrete retaining wall that separated Section 114 from the steep drop-off to the stadium's lower concourse. The metal railing bolted to the top of the wall, rattled ominously under their combined weight. Bruce gritted his teeth, tasting the metallic tang of his own adrenaline. Victor was pressing him hard against the barrier, heavy hands gripping the lapels of Bruce's ruined jacket, trying to muscle him backward over the edge. The drop wasn't fatal, maybe 10 or 12 feet onto the commercial carpet of the concourse below, but landing on a neck or a spine from that height would end a career. Or a life. "You talk too much!" Victor roared, spit flying from his lips and speckling Bruce's cheek. The larger man's face was inches away, contorted, his breath foul and hot. Victor shifted his grip, one hand dropping to Bruce's belt, trying to lever him up and over the rusted metal pipe. Bruce felt his feet slip on a patch of spilled soda. His center of gravity tilted dangerously backward. For a fraction of a second, he looked down. Below him, oblivious vendors were selling hot dogs, a blurry mosaic of red and yellow uniforms. The edge of the concrete bit into the small of his back. He was losing the leverage battle. Victor was simply too heavy and gravity was on his side. Panic, cold and sharp, threatened to spike in Bruce's chest. But he didn't fight the pressure. He remembered his own lectures. Be water. When a rock pushes into water, the water doesn't push back. It yields, it flows around, and it drowns the rock. Victor shoved violently, lifting Bruce's left leg off the ground, committing all his forward momentum to throwing the smaller man over the edge. Instead of resisting, Bruce suddenly went entirely limp. He collapsed his structure, dropping his hips beneath Victor's point of leverage. The sudden absence of resistance threw Victor disastrously off balance. The larger man lurched forward, his heavy torso tipping out over the empty air beyond the railing. Bruce clamped both his hands onto the thick fabric of Victor's polo shirt, right at the shoulders. He wasn't pushing Victor over. He was holding on to him, using the larger man's own terrifying forward momentum as an anchor. Victor's eyes widened in sudden, horrifying realization. He looked down at the 12-foot drop. His arms flailed, frantically trying to grab the railing he had just been trying to push Bruce over. Bruce dug his heels into the concrete, his muscles screaming under the strain as he held Victor half suspended over the abyss. The larger man was dangling, his waist pinned against the metal bar, his torso leaning precariously out into nothingness. "Pull me back!" Victor screamed, his voice cracking, the false bravado entirely gone. His heavy boots scrambled uselessly against the concrete wall, trying to find purchase. "Lee!" "Pull me back!" Bruce stood there, his chest heaving, his tie crooked, his knuckles bleeding slightly from the first impact with the fiberglass seat. The roar of the arena had faded into a distant white noise. He stared down at the man dangling from his grip. He felt the immense weight pulling at his shoulder sockets. He could let go. It would be effortless, just opening his fingers. Part 3. The weight of gravity. The stitching of Victor's black polo shirt began to tear. It was a slow, agonizing sound, barely audible under the ambient hum of the gymnasium's ventilation system, but Bruce felt the micro-vibrations in his knuckles. He held on. His forearms burned, the tendons standing out like taut steel cables against his skin. Holding a 240-pound man over a 12-foot drop wasn't a matter of simple strength. It was an exhausting, brutal equation of friction and leverage. Victor's dead weight pulled downward, a desperate, squirming anchor. "Pull me back!" Victor screamed again. His voice was a high, thin reed of panic, stripped of all the gravelly authority he had commanded 3 minutes ago. His heavy boots kicked uselessly at the painted concrete wall, leaving black rubber scuff marks. Below them, the concourse remained largely oblivious. A teenager in a red paper hat handed a cardboard tray of nachos to a patron. The smell of artificial cheese and stale beer drifted upward, mixing sickeningly with the metallic scent of Victor's terrified sweat. Bruce didn't pull him up immediately. He let Victor hang there for 3 long, excruciating seconds. He wanted the larger man to feel it. He wanted Victor to look down at the commercial-grade carpet and the sharp edges of the concession stands and understand exactly what his arrogance had bought him. The cynical, cold part of Bruce, the part forged in rooftop fights in Kowloon and hardened in cramped Seattle garages, whispered to just open his fingers. Let gravity finish the argument. It would be a definitive end to the harassment, to the endless parade of mediocre men demanding respect they hadn't earned. But Bruce's ribs throbbed fiercely where Victor had rammed him against the rail. His own breath hitched in his chest. He was a martial artist, not a murderer, and the grim reality of a police investigation, lawsuits, and the destruction of his own carefully cultivated reputation crashed over him like cold water. The anger dissolved, leaving behind a profound, weary irritation. "Stop kicking," Bruce grunted. His voice was strained, his teeth locked together. He widened his stance, dropping his center of gravity a crucial 2 inches lower on the sticky concrete step. He didn't try to muscle Victor over the bar in one heroic heave. Instead, he pulled backward and downward simultaneously, using his own body weight as a counterlever. The rusted metal railing groaned loudly. Victor's belt buckle scraped harshly against the pipe. With a desperate, undignified scramble, Victor got one elbow over the bar, then a knee onto the top of the concrete wall. Bruce released his grip on the torn polo shirt, grabbing Victor by the thick fabric of his collar, and yanked him the rest of the way. Victor collapsed onto the narrow bleacher walkway. He hit the concrete like a sack of wet cement, gasping, coughing violently as oxygen rushed back into his lungs. He curled into a fetal position, his hands clutching his chest, his face pale and slick with greasy perspiration. The fight was over. It hadn't ended with a cinematic knockout or a profound realization of martial superiority. It ended with a fat, terrified man crying on a floor covered in crushed popcorn. Bruce stepped back. The adrenaline dump hit him hard, a sudden shivering cold that started in his knees and radiated up his spine. His hands were shaking slightly. He hated that. He balled them into tight fists, driving his fingernails into his palms until the trembling stopped. He looked around. The immediate area of Section 114 was empty, the spectators having scrambled a dozen rows away to watch in morbid silence. The student with the broken nose was still on his knees near the aisle, bleeding sluggishly into his cupped hands, groaning a steady monotone note of pain. The other student was sitting heavily against a handrail, clutching a deadened thigh, looking at Bruce with wide, shell-shocked eyes. Down on the gymnasium floor, the tournament had finally stopped. The referee was pointing up at the stands. 2 middle-aged security guards in cheap yellow windbreakers were jogging up the far aisle, their key rings jangling loudly, looking entirely unequipped to handle whatever they were about to find. Jesus Christ, Bruce, a voice croaked. Dalton Clark peeled himself away from the structural pillar. The promoter's face was the color of old oatmeal. He looked at the groaning students, then at Victor, who was currently vomiting a small amount of clear fluid onto the concrete step. "You broke his nose," Dalton whispered, pointing a shaking finger at the kneeling student. "You threw Victor over the... You almost killed him." "He threw himself over," Bruce said. He reached down and picked up his charcoal suit jacket from where it had fallen over a seat back. The fine wool was smeared with gray floor dirt and something wet and sticky that smelled like Coca-Cola. "I just caught him." Bruce brushed the jacket off, but it was ruined. His ribs throbbed with a sharp localized heat. It wasn't broken, but the bruising would be deep. He felt a dull ache in his jaw where he had bitten the inside of his cheek during the impact. He tasted copper. He slipped his arms into the ruined jacket, adjusting his cuffs with an automatic, practiced motion. The mundanity of the action felt absurd against the backdrop of the battered men at his feet. "The police are going to be called," Dalton stammered, pulling nervously at his own collar. The peppermint smell of his breath mints was completely overpowered by the sour stench of vomit and adrenaline. "Victor's going to sue you, Bruce. The association is going to ban you. This is a disaster." Bruce looked at the promoter. He felt incredibly tired. "Let him sue," Bruce said softly. His voice was steady now, the cold calm returning. "Let him stand in a courtroom and explain how a man half his size held him over a railing by his shirt collar after he ambushed him from behind. I doubt Victor's ego will survive the public record." The two security guards finally crested the top of the stairs, chests heaving, their hands resting cautiously on the heavy flashlights on their belts. They looked at the blood, at Victor on the floor, and finally at Bruce, who was the only one standing calmly. "What happened here?" the older guard demanded, his voice cracking slightly. "A disagreement over footwork," Bruce said. He didn't wait for a response. He didn't look at Victor or the bleeding students again. He simply turned and began walking up the remaining stairs toward the exit tunnel at the top of the arena. Part 4. The Hollow Victory. The concrete tunnel leading out of the upper seating bowl was bathed in harsh, flickering fluorescent light. It smelled of damp mop water and ozone. The roar of the crowd, which had tentatively resumed its murmuring behind him, was cut off sharply as the heavy metal fire doors swung shut, sealing Bruce in the quiet, echoing corridor. He walked slowly. His right knee was stiff, the joints protesting the violent, compressed angles that he had forced them into on the stairs. He pressed a hand against his side, feeling the tender meat over his ribs. He would need ice and painkillers. He had won. He had effortlessly dismantled 3 men in less than 60 seconds in a confined space with zero preparation. By any metric of his profession, it was a flawless execution of applied mechanics. Yet, there was no satisfaction. As he navigated the winding, sterile corridors toward the loading dock exit, the reality of the encounter settled heavily onto his shoulders. It hadn't been a battle of philosophies. It hadn't proven that his streamlined, direct approach to combat was superior to their rigid traditionalism. It was just an ugly, desperate scramble in the cheap seats. It was crushed paper cups, sticky floors, and a middle-aged man crying because he realized he wasn't invincible. Bruce stopped near a set of double-glass doors that led out into the parking lot. He caught his reflection in the dark, tinted glass. His hair, usually impeccably styled, was messy. His tie was pulled off center, the knot ruined. A small smear of Victor's blood, or perhaps the student's, he couldn't be sure, stained the white collar of his dress shirt. He looked like a thug who had just stumbled out of a dive bar at 2 a.m. He leaned his forehead against the cool glass. The cynicism he had worn like armor all evening felt heavy and suffocating. He realized that pulling men like Victor Lawson out of the dark ages of martial arts was impossible because they weren't interested in the truth. They were interested in the fantasy. They wanted the choreographed bows, the crisp white uniforms, the illusions of power without the terrifying reality of chaos. When you introduced chaos to a fantasy, it didn't enlighten the dreamer. It just made them angry. The glass doors pushed open, and a blast of cool, damp coastal air hit his face. The Long Beach night was quiet, smelling of ocean salt and exhaust fumes from the nearby Pacific Coast Highway. The vast expanse of the parking lot was bathed in the amber glow of sodium streetlights. Dalton pushed through the doors a moment later, jogging slightly to catch up. The promoter was clutching a leather briefcase to his chest like a shield. Bruce, Dalton panted, stopping a few feet away. He looked terrified, as if Bruce might suddenly turn and throw him over a car hood. The guards are taking statements. Victor is claiming assault. I told them you were defending yourself, but Bruce, you can't come back tomorrow. The board is going to disqualify you from the demonstration. Bruce looked out over the rows of parked cars. The asphalt was still warm from the day's sun. I wasn't planning on coming back, Dalton, Bruce said. He didn't look at the promoter. There's nothing left for me to learn in there, and there's nothing left for me to teach them. You're making a mistake. You need these people. You need this network if you want to open schools. Bruce finally turned. His dark eyes locked onto Dalton, stripping away the promoter's nervous energy in an instant. I don't need a network of men who fight in their imaginations, Bruce said softly. I'm not opening dojos to teach accountants how to punch air. I'm going to figure out how to put reality on screen. I'm going to show the whole world what a real fight looks like. Then, they'll have to listen. Dalton stared at him, uncomprehending, trapped in his small world of tournament fees and regional prestige. On screen, you mean movies. Bruce, you're not a movie star. You're a liability. Bruce allowed a small, tight smile to touch the corners of his mouth. It wasn't a happy expression. It was a promise. He turned his back on Dalton Clark, stepping off the curb and out into the amber-lit lot. The cool air stung the cut on the inside of his cheek. His ribs throbbed in time with his heartbeat. He walked toward his car, leaving the sterile arena, the bruised egos, and the polite applause behind him. He didn't look back. The real fight hadn't even started yet. If you enjoyed this raw, grounded look into martial arts history, don't let the story end here. Hit that like button to support the channel, share this video with fellow martial arts fans, and make sure to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss our deep dives into the legendary moments that shaped the fighting world. Drop a comment below. Would you have pulled Victor back up? Let's hear your thoughts.